One of the reasons that sign languages can be of great interest to the language sciences is the opportunity to see language change in progress very quickly. We don't have a time machine and we don't have the ability to see what some of the first human languages looked like. We don't know what English looked like in its first generation or what Chinese looked like in its first generation. But in some cases, we have had the opportunity within the 20th and 21st century to witness sign languages being used in their very first or second generation in particular kinds of deaf communities. There are isolated deaf communities that come together in particular places, and as we see a first generation come together and use a sign language, we can see it changing very rapidly in a second or third generation. The studies of the rapidly changing sign language used in places like Nicaragua, with the famous case of Nicaraguan Sign Language, where children who did not have access to sign language either at home or at school, but formed signing communities on the bus to and from school, gave linguists an opportunity to witness how first, second, and third generations had rapidly changed and reshaped the input in the kinds of ways that I mentioned with respect to language change. There are communities that may have a higher than average rate of congenital or genetic deafness, and due to this, these communities, when they might be isolated from national sign languages, develop a sign language very quickly together, and that language is then transmitted to a second or third generation, and within real time, linguists can observe what are the changes that take place as each generation restructures the nature and shape of that sign language from previous generations. The learning of sign as a second language is important not only for increasing one's cognitive flexibility in the ways that I mentioned earlier with respect to bimodal bilingualism, but also for communication with individuals that may have hearing loss later in life. I don't want to mention my mom by name, but she's losing her hearing and I'm trying to teach her a couple of things. When we're in a restaurant and she says, "Where are you going?" And I say, "Sorry, I'm going up to the bathroom." And she says, "Where?" I say, "To the bathroom." She says, "Bathroom!" I don't want everyone in the restaurant to hear. So if I do this instead, and she learns that, it's much easier, right? So, you know, there are certain words that'll go a long way. With video and cell phone technology the way they currently are, sign languages may be even more rapidly changing, as the signing space is more limited within the visual field that's cut off outside the domain of the camera, and indeed, sometimes having to hold the phone with our left hand, or our non-dominant hand, does limit the use of contact on the non-dominant hand in sign languages on a regular basis. So who knows whether either the languages will change, or the technology will change, or both will be changing side by side very quickly. The ingenuity of certain communities to natural challenges is ceaselessly amazing, and one of the types of systems I've had the opportunity to study are whistled languages, which take place in communities where individuals over long distances, sometimes when they are shepherds that do traditional pastoral or herding activities, other times when they are hunting in the forests, use a whistled language in order to communicate. And the advantage of these whistled languages are that they can be successfully transmitted at a much greater distance than shouted speech. Now, what we were interested in is the extent to which these whistled language systems are productive or open-ended. That is, are they just for a few set of messages like, "Hey, I'm over here, bring the sheep over here, I'm coming back," or could they be used to encode literally any kind of message? And so for this reason, we conducted a set of experiments in these whistled language communities, asking the whistlers to produce non-words, words that weren't actually words in their language, and even to be able to distinguish whether they could tell apart a word from a non-word in the whistled language, to see if this was truly a communicative system that was open-ended and productive. These whistled language systems, however, we might say are some of the most endangered types of languages on Earth, because long-distance communication is now made possible by cellular phones. And indeed, there is one advantage, at least, that cell phones have over whistled communication, and that's the ability to gossip or have private one-on-one communication. If I'm whistling to you something that I want to be secret information, everyone around who understands the whistled language can hear and understand it. Teaching the whistled language as a unique aspect of particular cultural identities, and in fact showing communities that scientists have great interest in the coding properties that these languages can have, because after all, whistled speech is really very reduced in dimensions compared to spoken or shouted speech, right? Everything in speech that involves the nose, the larynx, the mouth is all being reduced to one whistled channel. In fact, if a language is a tone language and is a whistled language, they can only whistle the tones. They can't whistle both the vowels and the consonants and the tones. And so this is of great interest to the language sciences. That, along with actually sometimes whistling competitions that have judges and have particular events, are one of the ways that certain communities have encouraged the continued use of this tradition. At the moment, by certain estimates, there are approximately 5,000 languages on Earth that each have their own lexicon, grammar, pronunciation, and so forth. Now, is 5,000 enough to know what are all the possibilities? In fact, if we look at all of the possibilities, we see that certain types of languages that we might call logically possible are still never actually found. The fact that that kind of language is never found comes from the fact that such a language might not have ideal properties from a design perspective. And this very much ties into the question of, can we think of different human languages as adopting different design trade-offs? It's actually been studied that, for example, languages might choose to have more consonants, and languages that choose more consonants will have, on the average, shorter words. Or languages that choose longer words will, on the average, have fewer consonants. So we can think of, for example, the Hawaiian language, which has very long words, and on the one hand that might make it more difficult to remember long words, but on the other hand has fewer consonants in its system. And these are the kinds of trade-offs that languages might have. On the other hand, some of the languages of Southern Africa with clicks have a very rich consonant system, but have shorter words. These are the trade-offs that languages might take. And in this same vein, we might imagine, well, how might there be trade-offs in languages with respect to their word structure? A language like Mandarin Chinese, for example, although may not have very many prefixes and suffixes, has a much richer tonal system, whereas we know there are at least 5 pronunciations of ma, 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 and ma, the question word. So using 5 different tones in order to have different lexical meanings is a trade-off that languages can take. On the other hand, enriching their tonal system in order to have a morphological system that might not need as many prefixes or suffixes. One of the other kinds of trade-offs that we find in human language are often in writing systems. A writing system might, for example, represent the way that a language is pronounced, or it might represent the relationship between words. Let's take, for example, the 2 words in English, heal, like to get better, and health. Now, those 2 words are pronounced differently, heal and health, but they're written the same, H-E-A-L-T-H. Why do we write them the same? To show that heal and health are related to each other in terms of meaning and in terms of semantics. But if a language takes the choice, I'm going to write heal and health the same, they can't represent the pronunciation. And if a language says, well, I'm going to write them the way they're pronounced, it can't represent their similarity in meaning. You can't have both at the same time, and the trade-offs that languages choose in this are but one of the ways in which there are different design systems of human language that make different choices. As a linguist, one of the conclusions that we're able to reach is that all human languages have different design trade-offs, and that it's indeed very difficult to say if one language is more complex than another. These are all different manifestations of the human mind. These are all different regions of the design space of communication systems. And I think that being a linguist has, to me and to many others, led to a great humanizing force in seeing the importance and relevance of every individual language and culture. So ever since the so-called Tower of Babel, we've always had the question, why do humans speak so many different languages, and is that an impediment to cultural understanding? And in fact, a man who grew up not too far away from where my great-grandfather was from, by the name of Zamenhof, came up with a language called Esperanto. And the idea behind Esperanto was to have a universal language that could be used by all cultures, maybe as a second language, but was an invented language that could be used as a kind of lingua franca between different people in order to enable cross-cultural understanding. The idea of a universal language that could be used by all cultures actually goes back earlier than the attempts to develop languages like Esperanto, or even some of its fewer known competitors like what was called in Europe Volapük. And these two languages, as they're adopted, and there are still enthusiasts today of trying to learn these artificial invented languages, to have a universal way of classifying things that seem common to all human experience. We can classify artificial or deliberately invented languages into at least three types. The first type might be languages like Esperanto that were invented in order to facilitate cross-cultural communication. The second type are sometimes what are used in entertainment.
Leonard? Yeah?
Why are you speaking Klingon?
Why are you speaking English?
So in movies such as Avatar, there is what is known as the Na'vi language, which was developed by a linguist from USC, a bit based on some of the properties of the Maori language of New Zealand, although now it's evolving, there's a following, there's a dictionary, there are people who learn this Na'vi language. And the idea of developing more complex science fiction languages that have really their own pronunciation, grammar, syntax, and lexicon is to give these aliens, is to give these creatures from other planets, from other civilizations, from outer space, a more three-dimensional communication system. Now, we also might think of the very interesting movie called Arrival, in which a linguist is called on in order to try to communicate with the aliens that have arrived. And in the movie, she discovers that the language used by these heptapods is actually a purely visual language. And that's a key moment in this fictional movie where we learn that this different language employed by another set of creatures from outer space is entirely visual and not auditory, leading us to think about what might other minds be like that have a similar cognition but use a different output channel. The third type of invented language that's very often developed and used in the laboratory is for this purpose of developing and comparing possible and impossible artificial languages. And the idea there is to develop and design two very similar languages which differ only in maybe one or two properties, the property of interest, and then teach those languages to people in the laboratory and see how well they learn one or the other, for the purposes of seeing what is the landscape like of the human mind. What kind of structures does the human mind prefer to learn given two that are very closely matched and compared along maybe one or two dimensions?
Thank you for watching this episode of First Lecture. If you like this video, hit subscribe for more awesome content. See you on the next journey.